Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. This time around, we've got Sharks forward Will Smith. He had an all-around rather successful rookie season here in the NHL, but it was somewhat overshadowed by the fact that it happened alongside the rookie season of Macklin Celebrini, with him being that first overall pick, 18-year-old making his NHL debut. For a lot of fans outside of San Jose, the spotlight was mostly on him, and Will Smith kind of fell by the wayside. But us Sharks fans know just how strongly Will Smith, especially at the end of the season, played, that Celebrini, while he would finish third place in Calder Trophy voting for Best Rookie of the Year, Will Smith was a not-so-distant sixth, and you could definitely argue he deserved the top 5 position over Cutter Gauthier of the Anaheim Ducks. Now, Smith was the 4th overall pick back in the 2023 draft, a very strong draft year. Connor Bedard leading the way there, then Leo Carlsson and Adam Fantilli. All three of those players would make their NHL debuts right away. Smith, however, would end up playing his freshman year in college hockey in the NCAA with his two line mates of the previous season, Gabe Perreault and Ryan Leonard, and they absolutely lit that league up. Smith hitting over 70 points. That was the first player to do so in the NCAA in about 9 years. It just seemed as though the offense was coming a little too easily for him at that level, and so not so long after the year ended, Will Smith would end up signing his entry-level contract. This was quite interesting because neither Perreault or Leonard would do the same, but Smith believed that he was ready to make the jump to the professional level. This would actually occur a few weeks before the Sharks would even draft Celebrini at the 2024 draft. Now, Smith would end up playing in the Rookie Faceoff tournament in September with the Sharks, where he would look pretty good, but when he would make the jump to the preseason, he played 3 games, and it really wasn't all that impressive. Now, you usually don't read too deeply into preseason when it comes to like veteran players who have been in the league for many, many years, but for a young rookie player like Will Smith, you were definitely expecting somewhat more, and I can definitely say that outside of Celebrini, if this were any other Sharks prospect, they would have not started the year with San Jose. However, because Smith has that draft pedigree, he's that 4th overall pick, and he signed that contract out of college, they end up keeping him up with the main squad, and he ends up in the top 6 for the home opening game against the St. Louis Blues. But what we saw from Smith in that first game and onwards for much of the month of October was extremely low impact play. It's not as though he was this massive liability on the ice, he just really wasn't doing much of anything, and he pretty quickly found himself a bit further down the lineup, playing on the third line with guys like Barclay Goodrow and Luke Kunin, and you could certainly make the argument that when playing with players like that, it's going to be difficult to make much of an offensive impact at all, but Smith himself just didn't really seem to be playing all that well. The stage seemed to be a bit too large and a little too overwhelming for him. He just looked a step behind everybody else. And so for the first 8 games of his career, he would put up 0 points. 9th game, he'd score a couple of goals, but for the total of the first 18 games of his career, he had just 4 points. He would also make the jump during this time from center to the wing, as the Sharks felt as though that position was a little bit too difficult for him to handle at this point, at this top level. It should also be noted that during this time, the Sharks would give Will Smith these development days off, where certain nights where the Sharks would have a game, Will Smith would end up being a healthy scratch to give him the time to work on his strength and conditioning, or perhaps give him the aerial view of watching these games. Now, as time would go on, Smith would end up getting a little bit better through December, the early parts of January. Occasionally, Smith could have a pretty strong outing where we started to see the reasons for why this player was drafted 4th overall in 2023, showcasing his elite offensive talent, but it was rarely with any sort of consistency. While he could maybe string 1 or 2 strong games together, it would always fade back a little bit, and you'd have to wait for the next big moment. This was also a time in which Will Smith would sustain an injury that kept him out for a few games, and so all in all, not the greatest start. If we take a look at his point totals, the first 40 games of the year, going all the way up to January 20th, he played 40 games, 6 goals, 9 assists for 15 points. This is less than half a point per game. It's not terrible for a rookie, but for a 4th overall rookie, definitely expecting a little bit more than that. He was a -17 and averaging 14 minutes and 19 seconds. But January 20 was a very important date on the calendar for Will Smith. This was the Sharks game against the Boston Bruins in Boston, which is the area that Will Smith is from. He had tons of friends and family in attendance, and so it was a question of how he would do in front of all of those people. And indeed, he had one of his best games of the year, a goal and an assist. It was a game in which the Sharks would end up losing to the Bruins, but not Smith's fault. He was one of the best players on the ice for San Jose. But at the time, perhaps you're thinking that this was just another one-off type of performance, but instead, it ended up being the new normal for Smith moving forward for much of the rest of the season. Smith would start to put up points like pretty much nobody else on this Sharks roster. And even in the games in which he wouldn't get on the score sheet, you could still see him being able to make a large impact. He was still being able to set up chances and set up opportunities for his teammates, even if they would not end up hitting the back of the net. And so in 6 less games, so just 34 to end off the year, he had 12 goals, 18 assists, and 30 points, double what he had in the first half of the season. In terms of his plus minus, instead of being a minus 17, which wasn't terrible because the Sharks obviously were letting up a lot of goals, he was a plus 2. This was on a team that gave up over 100 more goals more than they actually scored this season. A team that ended the year on an 11-game losing streak. Will Smith was a positive player. And when it comes to his time on ice, you could see that the Sharks coaching staff recognized just how valuable Will Smith was down the stretch, going from 14 minutes and 19 seconds of ice time, which is around in line with like a pretty good third liner, up to 17 minutes and 40 seconds of ice time. That's in line with a really solid second liner. And the big thing is those 30 points, as I said, second on the team in terms of points during this final stretch, 1 point behind Macklin Celebrini. But if you actually look at even strength, he was actually tops on the team with 22, the only Sharks player to have 20 plus even strength points over these final 34 games. And if this were a smaller sample size, you might not read too deeply into it. 5-10 games here or there, that could just be written off as a hot streak. But 34 games, pretty much a couple of months, 2.5 months to end off the season, that is much more of a trend, and showed that for something there at that halfway mark, it clicked for Will Smith, and he really found his way here in the NHL. If you go back at the beginning of the season, he had a few major issues. As I mentioned earlier on, it kind of felt a little overwhelming for him. He couldn't quite keep up with the pace of the NHL, but one of the big standouts was also the fact that he didn't quite have the strength as a 19-year-old to really compete in puck battles and get body position and things of this nature. And I had mentioned at the time that that was a problem that likely wouldn't be able to be corrected during the season. When you're going and playing games every other day, you don't really have the time to bulk up and build up muscle and things of that nature. And indeed, this ended up being the case. It's not as though by April, Will Smith was having super strength and winning tons of battles left and right, but he instead adapted his game so that he didn't have to find himself in those positions all that frequently. Will Smith just showcasing such smarts at the end of the season here, right? We already knew about his elite offensive talent, his ability to shoot the puck and especially pass the puck, but it was his hockey IQ that I think really impressed me the most in these final couple of months. How he could read the play in the offensive zone to still end up being an effective forechecker. We just got finished with watching the Stanley Cup final between the Oilers and the Florida Panthers. The Panthers are the best forechecking team by far, pretty much in the entire NHL. You could see how every single forward through that lineup is able to separate man from puck in the offensive zone by laying the body and just having that strength to win those types of battles. That's not something that Will Smith could actually do, and yet he still managed to be effective in this particular role by simply understanding what opposing teams' defensemen were going to attempt to do, what pass they'd look for, what breakout opportunity they'd try, and Smith somewhat frequently would actually be able to break that off and intercept it. I remember a play against the Nashville Predators where it was, I believe, Blankenberg, defenseman for the Nashville Predators, who has this puck below the goal line. He goes for a pass. Will Smith picks it off, immediately sends it to Colin Graff in front, who puts the puck in the net, turning a Nashville possession into a Sharks goal within just a few seconds, all off the back of Smith just being and reading this play quite smartly. There was a play against the Boston Bruins in that season-changing game he had on January 20th, where he did something rather similar, picked the puck off of a player in the low neutral zone near the offensive zone blue line, comes in and ends up scoring a goal all within just a few seconds. And so Smith, it wasn't the greatest start to the season, but he ended up being one of the Sharks' best players near the end of it. And so his grade will definitely reflect that. Had he managed to maintain that 34-game pace at the end over a full season, he would definitely be right up there with Celebrini, but obviously you have to take off some marks because of the slow start. But all in all, still ended up being really good and exceeding expectations here as a 19-year-old teenage player in the NHL. He gets the grade of a B+. Class dismissed.